Every month I read a lot of publisher descriptions of new book releases, like a lot. And without fail, there is a certain group of phrases in these new book descriptions that always gets like my heart pumping and my heart racing and always gets me to click and add that book to my ever-growing TBR. And those are phrases like forgotten gem or lost masterpiece or long out of print or rediscovered classic. I'm making this lemon ginger tea. I can't have caffeine after my first two cups of tea and then coffee in the morning. So if I do drink tea, it has to not be caffeinated later in the day. There's just something really special about like rediscovering a book that has been lost to time or for whatever reason has kind of failed to stay within mainstream attention. It feels like finding like a buried treasure or a valuable antique hidden away in the attic. If you've been here before, you know why I'm going through all these new releases every month, because I have a newsletter devoted to new releases from small, independent, and nonprofit presses. So I am constantly scanning publishers' websites and coming across these books that were written long ago and are being given a second life by these small publishers. So I thought I would share some of these underappreciated books and publishers with you that I have come across fairly recently. I have these cookies, these orange cantuccini, they're like biscotti that I bought for Thanksgiving, and they're so freaking good. They're just little ones, but they're orange flavored and they're so good, and they're so good with my lemon ginger tea. So I think we'll take this party to the living room and we'll enjoy our tea and talk about long lost books. Is it a really bad idea to eat a crunchy cookie right next to a microphone? Not that crunchy anymore. Oh, there we go. So there are a lot of different ways why a really stellar book might have gotten lost in the shuffle of time and gone out of print. A lot of times it's just there are so many millions of books published every year. Not everything can stay in print, and sometimes real gems can kind of fall off the radar of the world of readers. Some of the works on this list are actually lesser known works by famous authors. So these authors have really well-known famous books, but then they have books that nobody seems to know anything about. Then you have books that are written by authors who are from marginalized communities that have been underappreciated historically in the literary landscape over the years, and so now are being brought back to life a bit by these smaller presses who realize how much these works of literature deserve readers' attention. And finally, many of the books on this list are from authors who don't write in English, and they are writers who are really, really well known abroad, but translated literature hasn't been prioritized historically by publishers in the United States, and so it's really just American readers a lot of times, or English readers, who are unaware of these incredible lost classics that aren't lost to the rest of the world, but are new to us. And really it's small presses that have been really leading the way in bringing translated work to the US, and really have been taking advantage of the growing popularity and driving. It's like a chicken and the egg thing, driving and taking advantage of the really growing popularity of translated literature among readers. And so a lot of these authors are well known, they're just not well known here. In general, I'll just add that small presses are a great place to find under the radar books of all kinds if you're into that kind of thing, which I am. Before we dive in, a little side note about the term classics. I don't like that word. I think it's used differently by different people. There are all sorts of different definitions for it. I tend to want to use it to refer to antiquity, but I think a lot of people just use it to refer to anything that is old and famous. And don't even get me started on the term modern classics. All the books on this list are at least 50 years old, so feel free to call that whatever you like. If you want to use the word classic, if you want to use the word modern classic, just use what you want. That's the list. It's anything that's 50 years or older, which is a little uncomfortable for me because I am every year getting closer to being a classic, apparently. Check out Italo Calvino's 14 definitions of a classic. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to it below. It is super interesting. I'm not sure I agree with all 14 definitions, but I think if you take those Italo Calvino's 14 definitions of a classic, add the word lost to each of those definitions, meaning books that should have fit those definitions, but were denied the opportunity to fit those definitions until now, until these small presses have brought these books back to our attention. And you'll have a good working definition for the books that I am about to tell you about. First up, we have Francisco from the publisher New Directions, written by Allison Mills Newman. This is exactly 50 years old. It was published in 1974, and the publisher describes it as a lost masterpiece of American literature. And that's another uniting feature of all of these books. There's a phrase somewhere. The publisher is using something like a lost masterpiece as part of its marketing copy. Newman's novel Francisco is described as profoundly underappreciated by the New York Times and has been long out of print and impossible to find. It's the vibrant story of a young Black woman's love affair with an indie filmmaker named Francisco. The author Saidiya Hartman writes the foreword to the novel, and Hartman describes the novel as a portrait of the artist as a young Black woman, and the narrative unfolds as a chronicle of this young woman's bohemian life in 1970s California. And I have seen other YouTubers who have read this and loved it. Next up, we have The Possessed, published by Grove in the US and Fitzcarraldo in the UK, by Witold Gombrowicz, and this is translated from Polish by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. Gombrowicz is considered by many to be Poland's greatest modernist, so not a lost or overlooked author. However, this is the first full English translation of this novel, which he published in serial form in 1939. And moreover, Gombrowicz wrote this novel under a pseudonym, only acknowledged it as one of his works like 30 years later in the 1960s, like shortly before his death. So Adam Thirlwell wrote the introduction to this new edition and says, "The Possessed, therefore, has the allure of a disowned work, a tacit work, a pulp novel that was written under a pseudonym, written only, so the story goes, for money. However, it is a phenomenal novel." Where is it? I have it. Ooh. It is a great novel. It's a playful, comic, gothic novel that takes place in the Polish countryside and features a haunted castle, specifically haunted by a bath towel, a haunted hand towel. And this haunted castle is inhabited by a mad old prince who's guarding his treasure. And it's also a twisted love story between a tennis instructor and his young bourgeois protege. And that young tennis protege also happens to be engaged to another man who is very interested in the treasure in this haunted castle. And it's just really fun and really fantastic, and I loved it. Speaking of Fitzcarraldo, they have a classics series in which they publish rediscovered books like The Possessed. And this past April, they published a book which they call a lost classic, overdue for rediscovery. And it's called The Man Who Cried I Am. It was published in 1967 by John A. Williams, who passed away in 2015. And I'm gonna read the blurb directly for you because it is deliciously twisty and I don't want to miss any of the details. So the novel follows Max Reddick, a novelist, journalist, and presidential speechwriter who spent his career struggling against the riptide of race in America. Now terminally ill, he has nothing left to lose. An expat for many years, Max returns to Europe one last time to settle an old debt with his estranged Dutch wife, and to attend the Paris funeral of his friend, rival, and mentor, Harry Ames. Among his friend Harry's papers, Max uncovers an explosive secret government document outlining a plan to terminate once and for all the minority threat to the whole of the American society. Realizing that Harry has been assassinated, Max must risk everything to get the documents to the one man who can help. This was greeted as a masterpiece when it was published in 1967, and I'm going to leave links to each one of these books below so you can check them out yourselves, and I highly recommend reading the blurbs for this one. It sounds phenomenal. Some of my favorite overlooked classics are books that nobody knows about from really well-known authors. So I had this experience with Edith Wharton's Ghost Stories, published by New York Review Books. Everyone I told about this book was like, Edith Wharton has a collection of ghost stories? They're awesome. Another example is from City Lights. So City Lights is a fantastic publisher and very famous bookstore in San Francisco, and they have published what they call an indispensable anthology called The Unknown Poe. These are brilliant, hard-to-find writings by Edgar Allan Poe on poetry, the imagination, humor, and the sublime, which add a new dimension to his stature as a speculative thinker and philosopher. And included are some of Poe's literary criticism, which I'm particularly interested in. I've heard that he writes incredible literary criticism. And then the second part of the book actually includes essays from his friends, other writers about Poe, including Charles Baudelaire and André Breton. Then we have a collection of short stories that have been described as an exceptional literary feat from a crucial, once lost figure of letters. Diane Oliver is described as a remarkable talent far ahead of her time, but she died in 1966 at the age of 22 and left behind crisply told and often chilling tales that explore race and racism in 1950s and 60s America. Grove has recently published her collection, Neighbors and Other Stories, saying, "In this first and only collection by a masterful storyteller, finally taking her rightful place in the canon, Oliver's insightful stories reverberate into the present day." So I'll read you a couple of summaries of the stories. So there's the nightmarish The Closet on the Top Floor, in which Winifred, the first Black student at her newly integrated college, starts to physically disappear. Mint Juleps Not Served Here, where a couple living deep in a forest with their son go to bloody lengths to protect him. Spiders Cry Without Tears, in which a couple, Meg and Walt, are confronted by prejudice and strains of interracial and extramarital love. And the title story follows a nervous older sister the night before her little brother is set to desegregate his school. I think this came out this year, and just the titles are amazing. It sounds so incredible. One of my favorite publishers has a lost work as part of their origin story. So Danielle Dutton, writer, editor, publisher, wanted to start a press for several years, and when she finally started her publisher called Dorothy, a publishing project, she knew she always wanted to publish only 2 books a year at the exact same time every year. And she already, for her first year of publishing, she already had a book by Renee Gladman lined up as one of the first books. For the second book, she chose a work originally published in 1954 and long out of print in the United States. And that book was Who Was Changed and Who Was Dead by Barbara Comins. And it's, oh, no. All the Dorothy books, oh geez. All the Dorothy books are the same size. It's hard to tell. Who Was Changed and Who Was Dead, holy moly. In interviews, Dutton has said that she knew nothing about Comins' novel before someone handed her a used copy, and after she read it, she couldn't believe that it was out of print in the United States, and she decided to start trying to buy the rights to publish it right after she finished the last page. And because Dorothy is committed to keeping their entire backlist in print, as long as Dorothy exists, this book will be in print in the United States. This is the story of the Willowweed family and the English village in which they live. It begins in the middle of a flood. There are ducks swimming in the drawing room. The flood is followed by a series of gruesome and mysterious deaths among the villagers. So again, this was published in England in 1954 and is called An Overlooked Small Masterpiece and a twisted tragicomic gem. I read some of the blurbs, and all of them mention how they can't believe this ever went out of print. So, for example, Jessa Crispin says, Comins is one of those writers you can barely believe ever goes out of print. Her books are so funny, so exact, so twisted, you imagine their appeal would last for generations. And then Emily Books says, this eerie novel with its sing-song cadences and deceptively simple sentences is nothing short of mesmerizing. A first encounter with Barbara Comins, who is still shockingly underread, is one of the most exciting reading experiences we know. One of the most beautiful and important branches of the publishing world, in my opinion, are small regional publishers who focus on writers and work from one particular corner of the world. Island Port Press is one such publisher. It is located in Maine, and they focus exclusively on writing from New England, and usually most of their books are specifically writers from Maine or about Maine. For the past several years, they have been reissuing the novels of a largely forgotten mid-century novelist named Ruth Moore. Ruth Moore was one of the most important Maine authors of the 20th century, and in her time she was compared to William Faulkner, John Steinbeck, and Flannery O'Connor. A novel called Spoonhandle was Ruth Moore's second novel, and it spent 14 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was made into the movie Deep Waters. But her popularity waned, and so by the time she died in 1989, most of her novels were out of print, until Island Port Press recently acquired the rights to publish her novels, and in 2020 they began reissuing them, a couple each year. So I'm not sure if they've reissued all of them yet, but you can get a bunch from her website, including Spoonhandle, which was her most popular novel. And that novel is about divisions among residents of an island in Maine. And these divisions are driven by an influx of wealth from summer vacationers. So kind of like a classic small vacation community story that sounds fantastic. UK-based Boiler House Press has an entire series of recovered books, which includes, for example, a novel called No More Giants by Joaquina Ballard Howells. Ignored when it was first published, No More Giants is now recognized as a classic work about women in the American West. It's a gripping story of a young woman growing up in the harsh setting of a Nevada ranch in the 1940s. The author herself was raised on a Nevada ranch, and in this novel, she portrays this way of life and its people, as the publisher says, with keen perception and powerful authenticity. Reminiscent of the work of Joan Didion and Sylvia Plath, Howell's prose pierces the myths of the American cowboy with a sharp feminist sensibility and reveals the bleakness, the violence, and the beauty of life in the remote high desert country, which just sounds so good. Snuggly Books is another publisher that is always publishing long-lost books from long-lost authors. Most of them are really out there. Visit their website, you'll see what I'm talking about. One example, Horror. It's by Edith Olivier, who is chiefly remembered for her fantasy masterpiece, The Love Child, which was published in 1927, was also the author of a number of other works, including 3 horror stories written between 1934 and 1935, which are gathered in this book for the first time. And the publisher says, these fine British tales of terror, uneasy, ghastly, and sometimes even gruesome, mark Olivier, despite her limited output, as one of the genre's unsung adepts. If these rediscovered books are up your alley, then you probably already know about Persephone, the highly celebrated UK-based publisher that basically this is all they do. Their entire existence is to reprint neglected fiction and nonfiction, mostly from women writers from the mid-20th century. Just go to their website and everything you see there could be on this list. On the US side, we have the also highly celebrated publisher New York Review Books, who also have their own classic series. Many, but not all, of those classics are what you could call rediscovered classics or underappreciated works that are due for rediscovery, including Lies and Sorcery by Elsa Morante, translated by Jenny McPhee. From the NYRB website, they say, Elsa Morante is one of the titans of 20th century literature. Natalia Ginsburg said she was the writer of her own generation that she most admired, and yet her work remains little known in the United States. Lies and Sorcery was written during World War II. It's Morante's very celebrated first novel, and it's as the publisher says, in the grand tradition of Stendhal, Tolstoy, and Proust, spanning the lives of 3 generations of wildly eccentric women. The story is set in Sicily and is told by Eliza, who was orphaned young and raised by a fallen woman. For years, Eliza has lived in an imaginary world of her own. Now, however, her guardian has died, and the young woman feels she must abandon her fantasy life to confront the truth of her family's tortured and dramatic history. And finally, if you are like me and you get that little thrill discovering these overlooked gems, I'll mention one last book that might help you on your journey, and that is 50 Forgotten Books by R.B. Russell. This is published by And Other Stories, and it says it's not quite literary criticism, not quite an autobiography, maybe a little bit of a mix of both, and it is also a guided tour through the dusty back rooms of long-vanished used bookstores, a love letter to bookshops and bookselling, and a browser's dream wish list of often overlooked and unloved novels, short story collections, poetry collections, and work of nonfiction. So I will end this by asking, have you read any books that you believe are underappreciated or overlooked? What I would really love to know about are books that are out of print that you think should be republished. And I'll mention one of my own. I'm pretty sure this is out of print. So this is Blood Tie by Mary Lee Settle. This was published by the University of South Carolina Press, and it was the winner of the 1978 National Book Award for Fiction. It is a great novel that begins with an accidental death and ends with deliberate murder. It's about American and European expatriates who take refuge in an ancient Turkish city, and once there, they wreak havoc on the Aegean paradise. Finally, I mentioned my newsletter earlier. I will leave a link to that below. Every month I send 2 emails, lists, both are long lists of books that caught my eye that were published by nonprofit and independent publishers in the previous month. I send one email full of fiction books, one email full of nonfiction and poetry. It is a labor of love. Takes me ages to put together, but obviously I find so many amazing books and there were several that on here that I had missed and didn't include in my newsletter, like The Man Who Cried I Am. There are like 40 books in that newsletter, and I scour publishers' websites. I missed The Man Who Cried I Am, published by Fitzcarraldo this year. So somehow things still fall through the cracks. I shouldn't tell you that because then you won't want to sign up for my newsletter. But I do include a lot of really awesome new books. Just forget everything I just said. Let me know of long lost books that you think are due for rediscovery in the comments below. I'd love to add them to my ever-growing list. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Sarah. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.